When a wealthy, entitled old man calls the police on a black delivery driver, he expects obedience. But what he doesn't know is that the man he's trying to humiliate owns the entire company, and what happens next will leave everyone stunned. The sun was blazing over the quiet suburban neighborhood, baking the pristine sidewalks and manicured lawns. The rhythmic hum of a delivery truck punctuated the stillness as it rolled to a stop in front of a grand colonial-style house. A young black man, clad in a crisp delivery uniform, stepped out with a package cradled in his hands. He glanced at the clipboard tucked under his arm and took a deep breath before heading toward the front porch. Behind a half-drawn curtain, Walter Hargrove, a retired businessman with silver hair and a permanent scowl, squinted at the scene unfolding on his driveway. His knuckles tightened on the edge of the curtain as his eyes followed the delivery man's every move. To Walter, this wasn't just a routine delivery, it was something suspicious. He muttered to himself, his voice tinged with a mixture of entitlement and paranoia. Who sends someone like that to a place like this? The delivery man, unaware of the brewing tension inside the house, reached the porch and rang the doorbell. He adjusted his cap and glanced around the yard, noting the immaculate landscaping. Just as he was about to place the package down, the door swung open and Walter appeared, glaring with the kind of disdain that could curdle milk. "Who are you? And what are you doing on my property?" Walter barked, his voice sharp enough to draw the attention of a jogger passing by on the other side of the street. "Good afternoon, sir," the delivery man said, keeping his tone polite but firm. "I'm here to deliver this package for Mr. Hargrove." Walter's eyes narrowed. "Do I look like I ordered anything? And even if I did, I'd expect someone more appropriate to deliver it." The delivery man froze for a moment, then set the package down gently on the porch. "I'm just doing my job, sir." "Doing your job?" Walter scoffed, crossing his arms. "Do you even have any ID? This doesn't seem right to me." The delivery man remained calm. "My ID is with my truck, sir. You're welcome to see it if you'd like." But Walter didn't want to see it. Instead, he pulled out his phone, shaking his head. "I don't know what kind of operation you're running, but this doesn't sit well with me. I think I'll let the police sort it out." "Sir, I'd suggest you don't do that," the delivery man said, his calm demeanor now carrying a trace of warning. "I'm just here to do my work. There's no need to escalate things." Walter ignored him and began dialing. The delivery man sighed, his posture tightening as he prepared for what he knew was coming. Around them, the quiet street seemed to hold its breath. Minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up, its lights flashing. Two officers stepped out, one of them immediately approaching Walter. "What seems to be the issue, sir?" "This man," Walter said, jabbing a finger toward the delivery man, "is trespassing. I don't know who he is or why he's here, but he doesn't belong." The delivery man's jaw clenched, but he held his ground. "Officer, I'm here on a delivery job. My identification is in the truck. If you'll allow me to retrieve it, I can prove that everything is legitimate." The officers exchanged a glance, clearly weighing the situation. "Let's check it out," one said, motioning toward the truck. Walter, however, wasn't done. His voice rose as he added, "While you're at it, you should search the truck. Who knows what he's really doing here?" As they moved toward the vehicle, the delivery man's calm exterior began to crack, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. There was more at stake here than Walter or even the officers realized, and with every step they took, the tension thickened like a storm gathering strength. The officers walked slowly toward the truck, their hands hovering close to their belts. Walter trailed behind, his face a portrait of smug satisfaction. He muttered under his breath loud enough for everyone to hear, "Let's see how professional this so-called delivery man really is." The delivery man followed reluctantly, his steady composure slipping as his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. He knew the drill, and he knew how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice calm. "Officers, I just need to unlock the cab to grab my ID and paperwork. It's all there." One of the officers nodded, though his partner maintained a suspicious gaze. "Go ahead, but move slowly." The delivery man stepped to the truck, pulled out his keys, and unlocked the door. He retrieved a leather folder and handed it to the officer. "This contains my company credentials and delivery manifests." The officer flipped through the folder, his expression unreadable. Walter, standing to the side, scoffed. "You're wasting time. I bet he has something illegal stashed away in that truck." The officer raised a hand to silence Walter before turning his attention to the delivery man. "Is there anything in this vehicle we should know about?" "Just delivery packages," the man replied. "You're welcome to inspect them." Walter grinned, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "I think you should. I wouldn't be surprised if there's stolen property or worse." The officer hesitated, then glanced at his partner. "Pop the back. Let's clear this up." The delivery man hesitated for a split second, then nodded. He walked around to the rear of the truck and opened the doors. Inside were neatly stacked packages, each labeled and secured. The officers climbed in, checking labels and looking for anything out of place. Walter craned his neck, still convinced he'd find something incriminating. "See anything suspicious?" he pressed. "No," one officer said after a moment. "Everything appears to be in order." Walter's expression darkened, but before he could speak, the officer added, "But let's run the name on these credentials, just to be thorough." The delivery man stiffened. His calm demeanor returned, but his eyes flickered with an emotion he quickly buried. He adjusted his cap and leaned against the truck, watching as the officers walked back to their car. Walter seized the moment. "See? He's nervous. He knows something's about to come up." The delivery man shot him a look, calm, but piercing. "Or maybe I'm just tired of being treated like a criminal for doing my job," Walter sneered. But before he could retort, one of the officers called out from the cruiser, "You're not going to believe this." Both Walter and the delivery man froze. The officer stepped out, holding a tablet. "The credentials check out. Not only does this man work for the company, but he's listed as an executive. One of the owners, actually." The words hit like a thunderclap. Walter's jaw dropped, his face a mix of disbelief and fury. "That's impossible. He can't be." The delivery man straightened, his voice steady. "I am. My name is on the paperwork you just verified. Would you like me to show you the deed?" Walter's face turned red as the officers turned to him, their expressions neutral but subtly unimpressed. The delivery man stepped closer, looking Walter directly in the eyes. "You called the cops on me, accused me of trespassing, and wasted everyone's time because you couldn't imagine someone like me could own something, could you?" Walter stammered, his usual confidence unraveling. I didn't know." "You can't expect." "You didn't care to know?" The delivery man cut in, his voice firm but controlled. "You saw me and assumed the worst." The tension was electric, the air between them heavy with unspoken truths. Walter's world, built on assumptions and prejudice, was cracking, but he wasn't ready to back down. His eyes darted to the officers as though searching for a lifeline. The officers stepped back toward their car, clearly eager to wrap things up. One of them turned to the delivery man. "Sir, do you want to press charges for false reporting?" Walter's eyes widened in panic, but the delivery man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Walter, the weight of the moment hanging between them like a gavel waiting to fall. The delivery man stood still, his eyes locked on Walter. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped, the tension thick enough to suffocate. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly caught between their duty and the growing discomfort of the scene. Walter finally found his voice, though it wavered. "Look, this has all been a misunderstanding. I didn't mean any harm. It's just, you didn't look like." "Didn't look like what?" The delivery man interrupted, his voice cold but steady. "Someone who might own a successful company? Someone who has worked hard to get where they are? Or maybe someone who deserves basic respect?" Walter shifted uncomfortably, his bluster crumbling under the weight of the delivery man's gaze. "I didn't mean it like that," he mumbled, but his words lacked conviction. The officers, sensing the tension rising again, tried to step in. "Sir," one of them said to the delivery man, "we're happy to escort you if you'd like to file a formal complaint." "This kind of behavior—" "Not yet," the delivery man interrupted, his eyes never leaving Walter. He stepped forward, his presence commanding, as if the roles had reversed and Walter was now the one on trial. I want to hear him explain, right here, why he thought it was acceptable to call the cops on someone just doing their job. Walter's face turned an even deeper shade of red. It wasn't about you, he stammered, his voice growing defensive. I thought you were trespassing. Anyone would have done the same. Anyone? The delivery man echoed, his tone sharp. Or just you, because of what you assumed when you saw me? Tell me, Walter, would you have done this if I looked like you? Walter's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His silence spoke louder than any denial ever could. You see, the delivery man continued, his voice rising slightly, this isn't just about me. It's about every person who has had to prove their worth to someone who decided they weren't good enough just by looking at them. How many others have you treated like this, Walter? How many people have you pushed down because of your narrow view of the world? Walter took a shaky step back, his confidence completely eroded. Look, I made a mistake, all right? I didn't mean anything by it. Didn't mean anything? The delivery man repeated, his voice cutting like glass. You dragged the police into this. Do you realize how dangerous that could have been for me? How often things like this don't end with a conversation, but with someone losing their life? The officers, clearly uncomfortable, glanced between the two men. One of them finally spoke up. Sir, we understand your frustration, but we need to handle this formally if you want to pursue any legal action. The delivery man turned to the officers, his face calm but his eyes blazing. And if I don't press charges, what happens? He walks away and does this to someone else? Or worse? Walter looked panicked now. I won't. I swear. I learned my lesson. The delivery man tilted his head, studying Walter as if trying to gauge the truth in his words. The silence stretched, each second feeling like an eternity. The officers waited, their hands resting on their belts, ready for anything. Walter's breath came in shallow gasps, his fear palpable. The delivery man finally spoke, his voice quieter but no less firm. Learning your lesson isn't enough, Walter. People like you need to start unlearning the hatred you've carried for so long. That doesn't happen in a day, and I'm not convinced it'll happen at all with you. Walter's eyes darted nervously to the officers, then back to the delivery man. Please, he pleaded. I don't want any trouble. Trouble? The delivery man laughed bitterly. You didn't care about trouble when you made that call. You only care now because you're the one facing consequences. The officers shifted uneasily, sensing the tension reaching a breaking point. Walter was visibly trembling now, his earlier bravado completely shattered. The delivery man stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. This isn't over, Walter. Not by a long shot. The officers stepped in then, placing themselves between the two men. Sir, one said firmly, we need to de-escalate this situation. The delivery man held their gaze for a moment before stepping back. Fine. But don't think for a second that this ends here. Walter sagged with relief, but his reprieve was short-lived. The delivery man turned to the officers. Take his statement. Make sure it's on record. People need to know the kind of man he is. The officers nodded, their faces grim. Walter opened his mouth to protest, but thought better of it. The delivery man watched him for another long moment before climbing back into his truck. He slammed the door shut, the sound echoing through the tense silence, and started the engine. As he pulled away, the weight of what had just happened lingered, heavy and unresolved. Walter stood rooted to the spot, his mind racing. The realization that his actions had unraveled so publicly gnawed at him, and yet, deep down, the simmering discomfort of being challenged churned. He glanced at the officers, their stoic faces offering no sympathy, and then at the few neighbors peeking from their windows, drawn to the commotion. The delivery man's truck had barely disappeared around the corner when Walter's wife, Margaret, appeared at the doorway, her expression a mixture of concern and confusion. Walter, what's going on? What are the police doing here? Walter wiped his damp forehead with the back of his hand. Just a misunderstanding, Margaret, he muttered, his voice tinged with irritation. Misunderstanding? Margaret stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. I heard shouting. Who was that man? What did you do? Walter bristled. I didn't do anything. He was lurking around and I... Margaret cut him off, her tone sharp. Lurking? Walter, was he really? Or is this one of your... She stopped herself, pressing her lips into a thin line. One of the officers cleared his throat, breaking the awkward silence. Ma'am, we're taking statements about what happened. There's no criminal complaint yet, but we're required to document everything. Document what? Margaret turned back to Walter, her voice rising. What did you do that needs documenting? Walter threw his hands up in frustration. Why is everyone acting like I'm the bad guy here? That man showed up unannounced, acting suspicious. Margaret's expression darkened. That man was delivering a package, wasn't he? I saw the truck outside before you called the cops. Her voice softened, tinged with disbelief. Walter, what exactly did you think was suspicious about him? Walter felt the weight of her question and avoided her gaze. I didn't know who he was. He didn't look like someone who belonged here. Margaret's face fell, and for a moment, her disappointment was almost unbearable. She turned to the officers. Do you need anything else from us? The officers exchanged a glance before one replied. Not for now, ma'am. But if there are further developments, we'll follow up. With that, they walked back to their patrol car, leaving Walter and Margaret standing alone in the fading afternoon light. Margaret crossed her arms, her eyes boring into Walter. Do you even hear yourself? She asked quietly. What you did was cruel. Reckless. Walter scowled, his defensiveness flaring. Don't you start with me, Margaret. He could have been anyone. For all I knew, he was casing the place. Margaret shook her head slowly, stepping back toward the house. Or he could have just been doing his job. But you couldn't see past your assumptions, could you? Walter's chest tightened as he followed her inside. The house felt colder now, the silence deafening. Margaret headed toward the kitchen, but before she could disappear, Walter spoke again, his voice softer. I didn't mean for it to go this far. She paused, her back to him. It always goes too far with you, Walter. And one day, it's going to be more than just a misunderstanding. Walter opened his mouth to respond, but the words died on his tongue as the doorbell rang again. He froze, the memory of the last encounter flashing through his mind. Margaret gave him a pointed look before going to answer it herself. When she opened the door, a different man stood there, clean-shaven, dressed in a sharp suit. His expression was calm, yet there was a quiet authority about him. Margaret hesitated, glancing back at Walter. Good evening, the man said, his voice even. I'm here on behalf of Mr. Carter, the gentleman from earlier. May I come in? Walter stepped forward, his stomach sinking. What does he want now? I already apologized. The man raised an eyebrow. I think you misunderstand. Mr. Carter doesn't want an apology. He wants accountability. Margaret's grip tightened on the doorknob, her eyes flicking between the two men. What does that mean? She asked cautiously. The man's gaze landed squarely on Walter. It means this isn't over. Walter's pulse quickened as the suited man stepped over the threshold, his polished shoes echoing against the wooden floor. Margaret hovered near the doorway, her unease evident in the way she clutched the edge of the doorframe. Walter straightened his back, trying to mask his rising anxiety with a show of defiance. Look, Walter began, his tone brittle. I don't know what kind of game this is, but I've already had enough for one day. The man didn't flinch. He placed a sleek black briefcase on the edge of the entryway table and opened it with deliberate precision. Inside were neatly organized papers and what appeared to be a slim tablet. He tapped the screen, swiping through several files before turning it to face Walter. This, the man said evenly, is a record of Mr. Carter's contributions to this community over the past 5 years. Donations to local schools, funding for public parks, and most recently, a sizable grant to the Small Business Development Fund. His eyes narrowed slightly as he added, the very fund that helped save your neighbor's bakery from closing. Margaret inhaled sharply, her eyes flicking to Walter. He's that Mr. Carter? Walter felt his chest constrict. He'd heard the name before in passing, a local philanthropist who'd garnered quiet respect from city leaders and residents alike. But the man he'd yelled at earlier didn't fit the image he'd conjured in his mind. I didn't know, Walter stammered, his voice cracking slightly. He didn't say anything. The suited man's expression didn't soften. He didn't have to. Mr. Carter's actions speak for themselves. Unlike your assumptions, Mr. Peterson, Walter flinched at the use of his name. What do you want from me? He demanded, a flicker of desperation creeping into his voice. I said it was a misunderstanding. I didn't mean any harm. The man tilted his head, studying Walter like a puzzle he was piecing together. What I want, he said slowly, is for you to understand the gravity of what you did. Your actions weren't just an inconvenience. They were a statement. A loud, damaging statement about who you think belongs and who doesn't. Walter's face burned. He opened his mouth to argue, but Margaret spoke first. He's right, she said softly, her voice trembling. Walter, you didn't just overreact. You let your fear and your prejudice take over. The words cut deeper than Walter expected. He looked at Margaret, searching for some hint of solidarity, but found only disappointment. The suited man pressed on, his voice like steel. Mr. Carter doesn't seek revenge or retribution. He's not interested in ruining your life. But he does believe in accountability, and he's asked me to deliver this. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward Walter. Tentatively, Walter picked it up, his eyes scanning the text. It was an invitation to speak at a community event hosted by Mr. Carter's company. The theme was Bridging Divides. Building a better future. You're asking me to speak? Walter's voice was incredulous, laced with disbelief. At his event? After everything that just happened? The man nodded. It's not a request. It's an opportunity to face your actions, to address what led to them, and to start making things right. The question is, do you have the courage to take it? Walter's hands trembled slightly as he placed the paper back on the table. His mind whirled with conflicting emotions: anger, shame, fear. He felt Margaret's eyes on him, waiting for a response. The weight of the moment was suffocating. Before he could speak, the man added one final remark, his voice heavy with implication. If you decline, Mr. Carter will consider other ways to address this. Ways that might be less productive for everyone involved. The unspoken threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Walter swallowed hard, feeling the walls close in around him. The room seemed to shrink as the gravity of the situation pressed down on his shoulders. Margaret broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. Walter, you need to do this. Walter looked at her, his defenses crumbling under the weight of her gaze. And if I don't? He asked, his voice hoarse. Margaret didn't answer. She didn't need to. The answer was written in every tense line of her face, every unspoken word in the room. The community center buzzed with activity as people filled the modest hall, the hum of chatter punctuated by the occasional scrape of chairs being moved. Banners adorned the walls with messages of unity and change, but Walter felt anything but united as he stood near the stage, gripping the edges of his speech. The words on the page blurred under his unsteady gaze. Are you ready? Margaret's voice, calm yet firm, broke through his thoughts. She stood by his side, her presence a tether to the moment. I shouldn't be here, Walter muttered. His voice was low, almost drowned out by the crowd. These people don't want to hear from me. Margaret looked at him, her gaze piercing. They need to hear from you. And you need to say it, for yourself, for this community, for all of us. Before he could respond, a voice over the microphone silenced the room. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight. Please welcome Walter Peterson. Walter's heart dropped. The applause felt like an assault on his nerves, each clap a reminder of the scrutiny awaiting him. Slowly, he climbed the stage steps, each one heavier than the last. As he reached the podium, the lights brightened, blinding him momentarily to the sea of faces. He cleared his throat, gripping the sides of the podium for support. His voice cracked. A murmur rippled through the audience. Among them, he spotted Mr. Carter, seated in the front row, his expression unreadable. I made a mistake, Walter finally said, his voice shaking but audible. A mistake rooted in fear and ignorance. When I saw Mr. Carter that day, I didn't see a man delivering packages. I saw a threat. His voice faltered, the weight of his words choking him. The crowd was silent, their collective gaze heavy. Walter pushed on, his voice gaining strength. That fear, that snap judgment, was my failure. I assumed the worst about a man I didn't know. Someone who has done more for this community than I ever have. A rustling noise at the back of the hall drew Walter's attention. The doors swung open, and a figure strode inside. It was Alex Carter himself. The man's entrance silenced even the faintest whispers, and Walter's heart pounded in his chest as Alex walked to the front and stopped just feet from the stage. The tension in the room was palpable, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. Walter swallowed hard, his hands gripping the podium tighter. "I owe him an apology," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But more than that, I owe all of you my effort to change." The silence was broken by Alex's voice, clear and deliberate. "Walter, why now? Why stand here in front of all these people instead of coming to me directly?" The question pierced through Walter's defenses, the room waiting with bated breath. "Because," Walter began, his voice cracking, "this isn't just about you and me. It's about everyone who has been judged, dismissed, or feared for no reason. I let my fear blind me, but I can't undo what's done. All I can do is try to be better." Alex's expression softened, but the tension remained. He took a step closer to the stage, his gaze steady. "Words are a start," he said, "but actions matter more. Are you ready to back them up?" Walter felt the weight of the moment, the challenge implicit in Alex's question. He nodded, his voice firm despite his trembling hands. "Yes, I am." The crowd erupted into a mix of murmurs and scattered applause, the atmosphere electric with unresolved emotions. Walter locked eyes with Alex, the unspoken understanding between them a fragile bridge built on the precipice of change. As the murmurs of the crowd grew louder, Walter's breathing quickened. His knees threatened to buckle, but he clung to the podium, willing himself to stand firm. The eyes of the community bore down on him, their expressions a mix of hope, skepticism, and anger. He had stepped into this lion's den willingly, but now he wasn't sure he'd make it out unscathed. Alex Carter stood before him, his arms crossed, his presence commanding. His face betrayed little emotion, but his eyes burned with a quiet intensity. The crowd sensed it too, the brewing confrontation, the moment where truths would either collide or converge. Walter took a deep breath, gripping the microphone as if it might anchor him to the ground. "You're right," he said, his voice trembling but gaining strength. "Words aren't enough. I know that. But this is the only way I could think to start. I needed to own up to what I did, not just to you, but to everyone." Alex raised an eyebrow, stepping closer to the stage. "You needed to own up," he repeated, his voice calm but laced with steel. "Let's talk about what you needed, Walter. What about what I needed? What about the humiliation, the fear of being arrested on my own property just for doing my job?" The room tensed, the audience hanging on every word. A ripple of discomfort spread through the crowd as Alex's voice grew louder, his emotions no longer held in check. "What about my daughter, who saw her father treated like a criminal? Or my employees, who watched me drag through the mud because of someone else's assumptions?" Walter opened his mouth to respond, but Alex wasn't finished. "You think this is just about you and me? No. This is about a system that lets people like you feel entitled to call the police over nothing. This is about a community that tolerates it. And now you want to make it right? Fine. But don't expect me to make it easy for you." The room erupted into a cacophony of whispers and murmurs. Some nodded in agreement with Alex, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Walter's face flushed, but he refused to back down. "I can't undo what I did," he admitted, his voice steady despite the heat rising in his chest. "But I can try to make things better. I want to listen. I want to learn. And I want to use what I have, my voice, my resources, to help fix what's broken." Alex stared at him for a long moment, the tension between them palpable. Finally, he spoke, his tone measured but sharp. "If you're serious, then you need to understand something, Walter. This isn't about a one-time apology. It's about showing up every day and proving you've changed. Not to me, but to this community." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Walter nodded, his resolve hardening. "I will," he said. "Whatever it takes." Before Alex could respond, a voice from the back of the room rang out. "Talk is cheap, Walter." It was a young man, his expression fiery. "What are you actually gonna do? Give us a speech and walk away like nothing happened?" The room fell silent again, all eyes turning to Walter. He swallowed hard, the pressure mounting. His gaze darted to Alex, who remained still, his expression unreadable. "I'm not walking away," Walter said firmly, his voice cutting through the silence. "This is just the beginning. I don't have all the answers, but I'm here to listen. And I'm here to act." The crowd remained skeptical, the weight of years of distrust hanging heavy in the air. But as Walter locked eyes with Alex, the unspoken challenge between them became clear. The road ahead would not be easy, and it would not be short. Both men stood at the brink of something bigger than themselves, and neither was sure what the next step would bring. The room fell into a contemplative hush as Walter stepped down from the podium. His face was etched with uncertainty, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the moment. The whispers among the crowd seemed louder now, a swirling mix of doubt and cautious optimism. Alex watched him, his expression unreadable, before finally speaking. "You have a long road ahead, Walter. Words are a start, but it's actions that will speak loudest. Don't think for a second that one speech erases the past." Walter nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "I understand," he replied, his voice quieter now but resolute. "And I'll prove it. Not to you, not just to you, but to everyone here." The room stirred as people exchanged glances, their skepticism evident. Yet, amidst the doubt, a few pairs of eyes softened, perhaps seeing, for the first time, a flicker of genuine remorse in Walter's stance. The tension began to dissipate as Alex turned toward the crowd, his voice steady and commanding. "Let's hold him to it. Let's hold all of us to it. Change doesn't happen with just one person or one apology. It happens when we demand better and hold each other accountable." The crowd erupted in murmurs, some nodding in agreement, others still wary. Walter felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Alex, his expression firm but not unkind. "You've got a lot to prove, Walter. But maybe, just maybe, there's a chance to get this right." In the days that followed, Walter made good on his promise, not through grand gestures but in smaller, consistent acts. He reached out to community leaders, began attending town meetings, and supported initiatives aimed at addressing systemic issues. He sold his shares in the real estate firm that had contributed to the neighborhood's inequities, using the proceeds to fund local businesses, including Alex's delivery company. For Alex, the journey wasn't easy either. Forgiveness didn't come quickly, and trust took even longer. But as Walter's actions began to reflect his words, Alex found himself less angry, less burdened by the weight of that day's events. Their interactions remained professional, but a cautious respect began to grow between them. The community, too, began to change. Walter's visible efforts inspired others to examine their own biases and assumptions. Conversations that had once been avoided were now happening openly, painfully, but honestly. One quiet afternoon, Walter approached Alex outside his office. He extended his hand, a gesture of humility and determination. Alex hesitated for a moment before shaking it firmly. "This isn't an end," Alex said. "It's a start." Walter nodded. "That's all I can ask for." As Walter walked away, Alex's young daughter peeked out from behind the office door. "Is he a good guy now, Dad?" she asked, her wide eyes searching his face. Alex sat down, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "I don't know yet," he said honestly, "but I think he's trying. And that's a step." The moral of the story is simple yet profound. Actions speak louder than words, and true change requires consistent effort, accountability, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Trust may be hard to earn, but it starts with a single step in the right direction. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow us for more thought-provoking and inspiring fictional tales.